Today's episode of the 6Ps podcast is going to revolve around gender roles and the way they are depicted in Alfred Hitchcock's film Rear Window. So let's provide you with a bit of a snapshot on the background information, which I'm sure you know already, but we have discussed this before. During World War II, women were integral on the home front. They worked in factories, producing things like ammunition, clothing, and these were typically industries that were very much male dominant before the war, and it provided women with newfound freedom and independence, particularly from a financial standpoint. No longer were they restricted by being merely wives or mothers and restricted to the household. And following the war, some women retreated, in fact most women had to retreat back to the home, while others sought to maintain their place in the workforce. And even thinking about Rear Window right now, I'm talking about Lisa. In terms of vocab, when it comes to gender roles, you can think of it as gender conventions or expectations or codes, even stereotypes around what defines someone being feminine and masculine. When it comes to writing, obviously we refer to them as men and women. Male and female we use as adjectives more so than nouns. So avoid using male and female as nouns. I much prefer men and women. But Rear Window really does look at these gender stereotypes and goes about dissecting them, challenging, endorsing, both really, depending on how you view the film. But what's really pertinent is the shifting gender roles of the time. We're looking at old versus new. So when it comes to old, I'm talking about, those traditional, conservative, conventional perspectives and views on what a man and a woman should be. We might even call them antiquated and outdated if you wanted to. When it comes to new, we're talking about, more modern and progressive views of how men and women should act. And when we talk about the shifting roles, we talk about the role reversals or the inverted roles or the transposed roles, particularly when it comes to the women in the text. So some really nice vocab there that you might like to use in your responses if you were to get a topic on this theme. All right, let's go through a really brief overview of the different gender expectations or stereotypes. So the first one, the stereotype of a traditional woman, is one who is repressed, one who is confined to their domestic duties or is seen as a carer, and to an extent as well, someone who is objectified. And we see that particularly through a character like Miss Torso and the way that Doyle and Jeffries view her. On the other hand, the traditional view of a man is one that should be desired by women, who is seen as a saviour, a provider, or a breadwinner, or one who's quite protective of women, and also one who is strong and brave. And this was particularly emphasised through the war efforts, where it was the men who were soldiers that went to war in World War II. On the other hand, we have this shifting view of women as being quite assertive and dominant, successful and also ambitious, not just in their social lives, but in their vocational lives as well. And this other view of men, the role reversal, where men were depicted as being reliant or incompetent, helpless, restricted and confined, which is particularly noticeable for L.B. Jeffries, who is stuck in his wheelchair. Let's start with this traditional view of women. And I've just selected two characters here. We've got Miss Torso on the left-hand side and Miss Lonely Hearts on the right-hand side. When we consider Miss Torso, she is objectified, particularly by the men, namely Jeffries and Doyle. The fact that she is called Miss Torso, she is described by the upper part of her body, and we see that of course through the male gaze, suggests how she is viewed. Here she's entertaining three men as well, so again she's providing that caring sort of role with the hosting duties, and she is later taken outside by one of the men, which Jeffries says she's picked the most prosperous one. While sort of Jeffries views her as being someone who is quite promiscuous, Lisa has a different view of what she's doing. We'll get onto that a little bit later. On the right-hand side, we have Miss Lonely Hearts, who conversely is hosting an invisible man on an invisible date. Jeffries views her as being quite lonely. He calls her Miss Lonely Hearts and defines her by her marital status. We would call her, I guess, a bit of a spinster. That is an older woman who's not married. And she would have been looked down upon by society, just as through the camera angles, we look down on her from a high camera angle. These are not the only two women who are viewed in this traditional role either, but just a snapshot of what we might analyse. Let's look at some evidence. Firstly, and the first quotation comes from Jeffries. He says, "Can't you see me rushing home to a hot apartment to listen to the automatic laundry and the electric dishwasher and the garbage disposal and the nagging wife?" This is Jeffries' views. He sees wives as being quite dependent on men. They are people who nag, and this links in nicely with his views on marriage as he lives vicariously. He is, of course, watching Anna Thorwald here from across, and this is done through cross-cutting, across the yard. The second quotation comes from Jeffries as well, when he asks Doyle, "How's your wife?" as he catches him leering at Miss Torso, again supporting this notion that women are to be objectified. Notice too the names, we've already discussed this, Miss Torso and Miss Lonely Hearts. The next quote, of course, is from Jeffries too. He says he's looking for someone who thinks of life not just as a new dress and a lobster dinner and the latest scandal. This is how he views women, that they're quite superficial. Again, he doesn't take, and we'll get onto this a little bit later, he definitely doesn't take Lisa and her occupation seriously. And the last quotation comes from Lisa, when she suggests that she, being Miss Torso, is doing a woman's hardest job. She's juggling wolves, that this is how women must live, really. They have to learn to sort of host these wolves, and again has really strong connotations, quite aggressive connotations as well. And we know that they obviously, Jeffries and Lisa, have differing views of Miss Torso. I want to just have a quick look at this idea of the male gaze, which at this time in 1950s America was the dominant worldview. We see the world through a man, and more often than not, the protagonist in these texts would have been a man, and they're the ones who dictate and shape the narrative. Whereas women were more so constructed as being, say, objects and are passively subjugated by the male gaze. And the example that we see here definitely is Miss Torso, through the way that Jeffries and Doyle view her. However, in this film, it's sort of tipped on its head. We have this reversal where Lisa is, I guess, the dominant one. She's quite assertive in the way that she dresses, in the way she stands over Jeff, and also the way she commands attention. And we particularly see that when she's lying down on the bed in front of him. It's interesting to note that in the final scene, it's Lisa who is the one looking at Jeff. And again, I think the male gaze is definitely something that you should be looking at as you critique and analyse this film. With women who go against those gender stereotypes, I think about Lisa and Stella. I particularly think of Lisa because she is quite assertive and dominant in the way she deals with Jeffries. Obviously, we've got the way she dresses. We've got the camera angles as well that work really well. She's often seen either trying to gain Jeffries' admiration or focus, or she's above him and looking down on him. I think it's important to note, given the context, that she wants to stay the night, and she's the one who sort of proposes that. And again, goes against the grain of what was expected at the time. Definitely sex was something that was seen to be done after marriage. While Stella, on the other hand, holds these really traditional views, particularly of marriage and relationships, I think the reason why she breaks the mold is she doesn't hide from anything. She's not squeamish at all. She wants to know, or she suggests that, you'd bury it head first, or the head somewhere and the body's elsewhere. She wants to know those details, and she's not afraid to ask. When it comes to evidence, this quotation, "If you're squeamish, just don't look," that's Lisa to Jeffries. And it also works a little bit later on as well, when he's quite helpless in being able to protect and save Lisa when she's trapped in Thorwald's apartment. She also says to him, "I'll trade you my female intuition for a bed for the night. Again, being quite dominant in the relationship in terms of dictating what goes on. And again, this would contradict the conventions at the time, where there was definitely, and it was shifting, but previously sex would have been considered only after marriage. And then we've got this idea from Lisa as well, when she says she's not in love with any of them when talking to Miss Torso, again suggesting, she ends up being right, because her partner returns home at the end of the film. But this idea of women, how they view each other, is very different to what we see through the male gaze and what we see through Jeffrey's point of view. Some symbols, definitely fashion and the way that Lisa dresses. The wedding ring is a good symbol as well. We get a close-up of that. This is Lisa as she sort of points to the wedding ring. Yes, she's trying to show Jeff that she's got the ring, but she's also making that subtle hint to the fact that she wants marriage. She wants to marry him. And again, proposing is seen as being the man's job. So I think this is a really important scene to look at, and one that I think showcases Lisa, breaking away from those gender stereotypes. The first thing is, in this scene, Lisa, of course, is breaking into Thorwald's apartment, so she's being quite brave and courageous, and also entering Jeffrey's voyeuristic world here, one full of danger. Notice the way she does it though. She maintains her femininity. She's wearing a floral dress and is in high heels, and shows herself to be quite adaptable. In fact, she breaks Jeffrey's assumption that she's not cut out for his world. In fact, she does. And in the process, she really impresses him, and again, breaks those gender stereotypes or gender molds. So you know how I said before that sometimes these characters can overlap as being viewed as being in that traditional light, but also in that more modern progressive light? I just wanted to touch back on Miss Torso and Miss Lonely Hearts, because they show themselves to be quite strong. In fact, both these female characters physically push men out of their apartments. Miss Torso after her night out, and Miss Lonely Hearts when she brings back a young suitor to her apartment. So don't feel like this film is clear-cut in the way it depicts genders. And again, look for that unique interpretation on how you might view these gender roles. Let's look at the traditional view of men. And I think Doyle and the songwriter are two secondary characters that you could look at here to showcase the traditional view of men. Doyle, particularly the way he views Miss Torso, he objectifies her continuously. With the songwriter, he's depicted as being a bit of a saviour, saving Miss Lonely Hearts through his music. Again, I'll talk about Jeffrey's to start with. He says, you just have to face it, Lisa, you're not cut out for this world. Again, and this is a continual theme throughout the film, is men underestimating women, and Jeffrey seeing Lisa as not fit or not cut out for the man's world. He also is quite condescending towards her and quite sarcastic when she explains her day. Note how she's been the one working all day and he hasn't been. He's been stuck in his apartment. He's been stuck at home. And he says, tell me, what was Mrs. Haywood wearing? Really condescending. He doesn't respect her job at all, doesn't really respect her industry. Doyle's the next quote. He says that feminine intuition stuff sells magazines, but in real life, it's still a fairy tale. I don't know how many times I've chased down leads based on women's intuition. Again, solidifying this view that women weren't really respected or admired at all, and their views weren't taken seriously. As we know, it is Lisa who sort of cracks the case almost when it's the jewellery that she notices as being the clue or the hint that something's not right there. The last quote is, look, it's not really quote worthy, but it's interesting to note when and it's a jibe again at Stella as she's talking about marriage. She just says, fix me a sandwich to her. Again, this idea that men view women as merely being individuals who can fit into their domestic lives. Let's look at the role reversal when it comes to men, and we see the helpless and restricted L.B. Jeffries here. This shot particularly is important. This is after Thorwald has turned out the lights. Lisa is screaming out Jeff's name, but he can't do anything. he's stuck and unable to help her. So let's have a look at some sample essay topics which revolve around this key theme of gender roles. The first one, to what extent does Rear Window endorse traditional gender roles? Again, we have one of these to what extent, so is it to some extent, to no extent, to a limited extent, to a significant extent? And does Hitchcock promote or endorse traditional gender roles? Does he warn? Does he want to warn the audience about them? Does he want to challenge them, critique them, condemn them? Again, your essay should really focus on that. The second one, I like this one. Hitchcock's film is entirely anti-feminist. Do you agree? This is a topic where I'd definitely be looking at the male gaze and how the female characters in particular are positioned or depicted throughout the film. The third one, the women in the film are more admirable than the men. Do you agree? Again, another character-based one, but one again where you should look at which side you want to argue with there, and again, consider your evidence and ensure that you've got evidence to support whatever view you have of that one. For me, though, particularly, I think the women are more admirable in the film. I would definitely be arguing that way because you've got these really strong female characters. The last one, she's doing a woman's hardest job juggling wolves. The women in Rear Window are helpless and vulnerable. Do you agree? Again, another essay topic where you've got this phrase, the women. A tip for me particularly would be to not just rely purely on the women as examples. I think you can definitely bring in men, especially Jeffries, because it's his perspective that we view them from. But again, these words, helpless and vulnerable, think about synonyms for those. If you've got a quote in your essay topic, always use it somewhere. It's up to you where you want to use it. I like to pop it in my first main body paragraph if I can. Others like to put it in the introduction. There's really no right or wrong way to do things, but always remember that is a free quotation for you to use. Let's have a look at a sample paragraph based on an idea revolving around gender roles now. And the topic sentence is that Jeffries is unable to see the residents' problems clearly because he's a product of the 1950s conservative views and values. American society adhered to traditional gender roles whereby the sexes were governed by strict hierarchy. Men were deemed to have positions of control and power, while women took on more subservient roles. Miss Torso is clearly objectified by Jeffries and other males, such as Doyle, perceived as an object of desire. This is enhanced by Hitchcock's construction of mise-en-scène, intentionally dressing her in revealing clothing throughout the film, compounding her apparent value solely in her physical appearance. Jeffrey's labelling of her as Miss Torso strips her of any other identity, and the viewer is invited to see her just as a sexual figure instead of a vulnerable professional dancer. Lisa is arguably the only one who sees her problems clearly, refuting Jeff's contention that she has the pick of a partner due to her appearance. In likening her suitors to wolves, she touches on the idea that she is being preyed upon by the men that surround her, an idea that Hitchcock subtly hints on with her older suitor forcing Miss Torso into a prolonged kiss on the balcony. In presenting this idea early in the film, Hitchcock invites the audience to shed their preconceived gender bias and invites them to view the film's other female characters, such as Miss Lonely Hearts and Lisa, in a new light. Jeffries cannot shift his viewpoint in such a manner and, as a result, cannot see the female character's problems clearly. It takes Lisa's forced entry into Thorwald's apartment for him to see that women are not all bound by the conservative generalisations of society and may indeed be his equal. So, what are some key takeouts from today's episode? The first thing is to relate gender roles to other themes because they all overlap. So, think about marriage and relationships, think about voyeurism, isolation, and confinement as well. Create your own quotation banks and consider next level analysis such as film techniques and context information when dealing with this theme. But that's all from me today. Tune in next time for another episode of the 6Ps podcast.